Thank you very much for the introduction, Edith. And I hope that you will all find this talk at least somewhat interesting. It's a somewhat speculative talk. I've been thinking about this issue or this set of issues for a couple of years. I planned on giving you this talk, a little while ago, even before the current events that have been shocking our nation, which seem to testify to a common need for more kindness. I do believe that architecture has the capacity to be kind. And I do believe that classical architecture offers an incredibly valuable set of tools in this direction. So I hope that you'll find the talk, even if you don't agree with everything I'm going to say, because again, it's somewhat speculative. It's a weird combination of history and theory, to be completely honest. I hope you'll find it provocative, at least. So I should probably begin by telling you how I came to this place, how I wanted to write a talk and to explore the problem of kindness. And it began because I found myself in a particularly vulnerable psychological state and was in Barcelona after a month and a half of being on the road, traveling, doing research, spending time with colleagues, some of whom are wonderful, some of whom are not so wonderful, spending a lot of time with strangers. And then finally, I was going to go to Barcelona and meet one of my best friends who's from another part of Spain. And I was going to put my luggage aside and I was just going to spend time with a dear friend. When I got to Barcelona, after about 9 hours of traveling and walking, subways, buses, airplanes, you name it, I was exhausted. And then I realized when I got to the hotel that he had booked that he had gotten his dates wrong and that he was coming the next day, and that there was no reservation for me. And anybody who's been to Barcelona knows it's a huge tourist town. There was no reservation anywhere. I couldn't find a thing. So I was sitting there in Barcelona looking at the prospect, already exhausted, of having no place to stay. And then the people at the hotel weren't especially nice to me. The people where I went to get some food weren't especially nice. It was a hard day. Finally, I managed to find some place to where I could throw my luggage and sleep. It wasn't especially nice. And then the only upside to this place is that it was very near the Casa Mila, one of the buildings I wanted to see by Antoni Gaudi, who's a famous expressionist architect, as I'm sure all of you know. And so I was depleted, exhausted, and walking down to see this building, and there was a little cafe inside. I didn't even know they had a cafe, and I stepped inside the cafe, and it wasn't open yet. And I thought, okay, well, another little bit of bad luck. But then the people came to me and they said, it's okay, don't worry. You can sit down here, you can relax, you can just take it easy. And they brought me a beer, and they brought me some little olives that were the most delicious olives I've ever had in my life. And the soft, wonderful, flowing architecture of Gaudi, this incredible roof. I felt like I had been swaddled in a blanket. And these little gestures of kindness made me feel so at home. I could finally relax after a long, long, hard day. And many people have had a lot longer, a lot harder days. Don't get me wrong. I'm not pretending like I'm a huge victim or something. But you know what it's like. You have a long, hard day, and then somebody is nice to you, and it just feels so good. And the building was a huge part of that experience. The soft, undulating roof, which is original to Gaudi, and then I was sitting on this. This is the picture I took, and I finally just kind of melted into this cushion. And I was looking up at that column, and I was thinking that. I was just so kind of tuned in to gestures of warmth and softness and kindness. I was looking at that column and thinking, that's not Doric, that's not Ionic, that's not Corinthian, but it's a kind of capital, and it just looks like it's being sweet. It just looks like that column is making an effort to gently expand and to support, to kindly engage with that bit of architecture it's supporting, which itself, because it's Gaudi, was soft and flesh-like, almost like the underbelly of a whale or something. And that column was working hard. It was expanding and doing its best to enter into a kind of negotiation so that it could support that architecture with a little more kindness, a little more warmth, just like I was being supported by the warm pillow on that cushion. And I thought, that's really what all these column capitals have in common, in fact, and that they seem kind. They're working to negotiate with the other members of the structure, and they're doing so in a way that's visibly excessive, visibly above and beyond the need of structure, just like the people in this restaurant are going above and beyond the needs of commerce. So kindness, I mean, I should probably define that word since this whole talk kind of hinges on it. It is an abstract word. It's a word that we all take for granted. I don't usually throw the dictionary at people, but in this case, I think it'll be valuable. It's an old word. It dates back to Middle English for kindness, which meant noble deeds or courtesy. And kindness can refer to specific acts, when you offer assistance to somebody or an expression of affection. And those are two different kind of specific acts. Kindness is giving somebody a glass of water when they need a glass of water. It's giving somebody a strawberry when they're hungry. These are basic physical needs. But it's also doing things that are not necessary, doing things that are not functional for your biological survival. It could be simply saying good morning, simply saying hello, doing something, in fact, that is, when somebody is obligated to give you water, it doesn't count. And when somebody is obligated to open their mouths and say words at you, it doesn't count. But when somebody willingly goes beyond what is required, beyond what is obligated, and they do so in such a way that it makes you feel taken care of, that it makes you feel safe, that it makes you feel well and valued and important, then that's kindness. And so it can be a meaningful gesture. It can be a meaningless gesture in many ways. It can be specific, but it can also be overall. A person's manner can be kind. An environment can be kind. This like horrifically sweet Victorian engraving, it's everything about it is kind. These two people are being so sweet to each other, and the flowers all around, it's a kind, nurturing environment. The little gate back there suggests that this is an accessible place. Even the butterflies above are like giving a little kiss up in the sky. This whole image is all about mutual affection, welcome, life, warmth, gentleness. This is a place of safety and well-being. And the question is, does architecture engage in this manner of communication and this manner of perception? I think it does. And I agree that kindness is a metaphor, inevitably, with architecture. Architecture doesn't have a will, although many cultures in the past have believed it did, and we'll talk about some of those in a moment. But we know that architecture is probably not alive and that it doesn't actually have a spirit inside of it, at least not in the same way that humans do. And so it's clearly a metaphor. But I think it's a metaphor that's very important. And it's important for several reasons. And those reasons I'm going to explain and nurse throughout this entire talk. But let me explain what I mean, though, when I use this metaphor. There are a few different ways that architecture can express kindness, that architecture can help make people feel warm and well and welcome, can feel that they matter and that they are in a healthy and sympathetic place of peace and stability where they belong, where they are safe, and where their needs as a living, dignified but vulnerable organic being can be met. One of them is found in the ways that the different structural members of a work of architecture relate to one another. These members can engage one another with a visual poetry of mutual negotiation, engagement, collaboration, diplomacy, and celebration. The members of a structure should not be seen engaging in hostile acts with one another as dominant members overwhelm and impose themselves upon passive members, but rather architectural members, structural members should reach out to one another as these two columns embrace and intertwine, creating a visual language of healthy, safe, stable, peaceful relationships. It's said that justice and peace are inextricable from one another in our human societies. Well, when different members of a structure are seen doing justice to one another as they collaborate to create an architectural system, visual peacefulness is the result. A structural sympathy, a systemic kindness seems to infuse the building. The second way that buildings can express kindness is by pulling viewers into the structurally sympathetic system thus created. And the way that buildings do this is by visually blossoming and warm vitality, presenting evidence that the architecture is itself healthy, welcoming, and sufficiently tied into creative forces, however defined, to sustain visitors. In other words, once the building conveys its own internal justice, its own balance, and its own kind of internal kindness as a balanced ecosystem of healthy parts, it then expresses its capacity to welcome you into that ecosystem and to sustain you. It greets you, and it offers nourishment. And it does this by revealing its environmental vitality, presenting organic textures and fabrics, presenting you with visual cues and signals of life. Chief among these, I would argue, is the flower. We will speak a lot about flowers today. When architecture flowers, when it's seen as a healthy, wholesome thing which is stable in and of itself, and then it flowers to you, it is being kind and has the capacity for kindness that it develops internally, and then it extends that kindness to you. The Doric column, and of course this is the most primitive state of the Doric, but I choose to use this example because their so-called pillow capitals convey the key principle of the Doric with utmost clarity. These pillow capitals are called that because they look like pillows. The column has become soft. It could have remained stubbornly, rigidly vertical. It is made out of stone, after all, but instead the column has allowed its head to bow. It has become squished, taking a moment to become soft, gentle, and kind as it intersects with the other structural member. The column does not just conduct its stony business with the lintel above in a cold, matter-of-fact way, throwing it into the air whether it likes it or not, but rather the column slows down and stops to say, "Hello, good morning, nice to see you, lintel," and then kindly raises it in a way that takes more effort, but is clearly much comfier to our dear friend and colleague, the lintel. Now, as subsequent evolutions of the Doric attest, there is a fine line here. You don't want your columns to look too squishy, because squishy, gushy columns might collapse, and that is very bad. Columns should look strong, but they should not look like tyrants or bullies that impose their will on other architectural members in a cruel or arbitrary way. The lintel, left to its own devices, does not really want to hang up there in the air. It wants to come down. Gravity ensures that the surface of the earth and large stones have that kind of relationship. This lintel is being held up, but we cannot read it as a passive victim that is being kidnapped and carried off to a lifetime of forced labor because the columns are going out of their way to make it nice. They are being soft and gentle, transitioning from vertical to horizontal in and of themselves in their own bodies, and thus the interest of the columns and the interest of the lintel are united in a gentle and kind way. So the Ionic capital, much like the Doric capital, it is the things that make it what it is are examples of negotiation and diplomacy. The column goes horizontal with the fluting right before it commits itself to the horizontal lintel, with the column compromising its own nature in the process, providing a moment of transition. And of course, the flutes are very soft. Like the idea is that they look like very soft, coiled, something you could rest your head on very comfortably. And therefore, the lintel must also be interpreted subconsciously as being comfortable. Even more so, right, with the Corinthian column, which is the ultimate in softness. There is, I think, nothing more superfluous than the gift of a flower. Right, 99 times out of a million. Well, no, that's a terrible set of odds. 999,999 times out of a million. You cannot eat a flower, nor can you drink the flower, nor can you use the flower to purchase anything. The flower is hopelessly useless, except that it's delightful. And the reason it's delightful is partly aesthetic, because it looks wonderful. But it's also delightful when it's given to you because it's an expression of sentiment. It's an expression of care. The only reason they gave you that flower is because they want you to feel nice most of the time when flowers are given. And so this column presents this wonderful bouquet of acanthus leaves, which is often includes foliations of different kinds with flowers, and is giving a gift of a soft, springy bed that looks visibly comfortable, but also this gift of a bouquet. Um, it's significant that the lintel itself, that the entablature is also foliating and providing a sympathetic array of botanic life. And it's also significant that the cornice is engaging in all manner of mathematical sophistications, because it's going out of its way to avoid an abrupt end. And indeed, even the pediment roof, right? It's essentially, there's a million reasons to have a pediment roof, to have a gable. It helps shed water, of course. We all know these things, but in addition, visually, it's so gratifying, because the building essentially just gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller as it goes up until it disappears. And indeed, as those lines converge in the point, as they compromise, indeed, with the sky itself, as the building blends in with the sky, usually when they meet together, the lines don't annihilate each other. There's usually a little acroteria, often a little pinnacle, a little celebration. And indeed, this building almost likely originally had one. On the side, where the cornice flanges out, it also makes a transition to the sky, as it goes from verticality to a gesture of horizontality. Again, I know it's also good for shedding water, but that's not the point. There are other ways to shed water. This is a magnificent way of having all the lines of this building go out of their way to blend in with the next moment. Whether that next moment goes from the base of the column to the shaft, to the capital, to the lintel, to the roof itself, and then to the sky. And the undulating rhythm of the tiles on the side also helps the building to kind of blend in with the sky. There's an opposite to all of these transitions, all of these moments of diplomacy, and that is abruptness. Abruptness, as we all know, is when something happens suddenly, when it's done quickly, when it's done without any gesture of transition, any extra superfluous word or motion. And abruptness can hurt. I mean, it can physically hurt. If you have an abrupt start in an elevator, there's almost nothing more terrifying, because you get the impression that the elevator is no longer keyed to human needs, and that something terrible could happen. An abrupt turn in an automobile is also dangerous and scary. We need softness. We are organic beings, and abruptness in a barista or in another human being is scary. When somebody says good morning, again, when they say good afternoon, how are you doing? That kindness, even though it's totally useless, when people get together to discuss the distribution of aluminum clips, and they start off the conversation with, "Hey, how you doing, Michael? How's Edith? How's her hand after that bowling accident?" "Oh, she's doing fine. None of that has anything to do with the distribution of aluminum clips. But what it does have to do is the creation of a fabric, of a social and cultural fabric that is dedicated to more than just transactions, that is dedicated to something other than oppression, something other than exploitation. It's a place where mutual engagement creates a sense of well-being, where care is expressed. And it's in those places, in those transitions, where care is expressed. Care is not expressed when you buy a coffee and you get a coffee. Care is expressed when you say hello, good morning, and then that person says good morning back to you and gives you a smile. These are the things that help a society continue to run. And without sympathy, without kindness, it doesn't matter how wealthy your society might be, it's not going to last, which is, of course, something we've been seeing lately. Oppression, exploitation, even a simple lack of sympathy will begin to unravel a whole society. You need sympathy, you need kindness, you need warmth, and architecture has a role in conveying these things. So abruptness, right? The sudden stop. The lack of regard, the lack of care, the lack of communication for the interest or even the existence of the other, whether it's the other member of a structure or the other member of a society. Abruptness is unkind. And it's amazing that this building even has a colonnade. Like, by doing that, it has at least initiated a conversation with humans. But it is an abrupt conversation. Not only do those columns show no interest in raising that plinth in such a way that it has any comfort or softness or is an equal partner. In fact, it impales the thing. It looks visibly painful. That thing is being suspended like a Turk at the hands of the barbaric Romanians at the time of the wars in the Balkans. This is barbarism. This is cruelty. This is meanness. And you might think it's silly for me to run this far with an office building, especially one that's regarded as a UNESCO treasure. But now I'm going to get to the next point, in which I try to argue that this is not evidence that I have a psychological problem. I do have a psychological problem, but so do you, and so do all of us, and that's because we're humans. I don't know how many of you have seen this image lately, but it's been making the rounds in Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all the usual venues as a meme. And if I was live with you in person, I would beg you to tell me what you see. But I'll have to just say it. They're hugging. It looks like they're hugging. And that's why people are looking at this and sharing it all over the world, because most people look at this and they say, oh, it might take a second, it might take 2 seconds, but you see the hug. And if I showed this to my wife and she didn't just see the hug, she said she thought the other building, the one that's not extending its arms, looks like it's having, quote, a Me Too moment. That the building that's doing the hugging, its hand is a little too low, and the other building is a little drawn up and kind of looks like it's a little uncomfortable. This is something we do. And it's something that we've always done, and it's something that people have been talking about for a long time. There is a universal tendency amongst mankind to conceive all beings like themselves, and to transfer to every object those qualities with which they are familiarly acquainted and of which they are intimately conscious. So David Hume is not the first, but he's one of the first people to not to notice it, but to theorize this idea that humans see humanness in inanimate objects, that we look at everything, whether it's the lightning or whether it's a rock, and we have a tendency to project our own experiences and knowledge and even our own being onto these things. It's a natural thing to do. Stephen Houston, a famous Mayanist, an epigrapher, and an anthropologist, has summarized all the scholarship on this topic by saying the impulse to humanize the inhuman is an inescapable part of cognition. It's just rooted in the way we think. It recurs because of psychological determinants, including the comforting attraction of ready knowledge, the necessity of meeting threat and seeking advantage, and the pull of social affiliation. Just like me, when I walked into that cafe in Barcelona, I was feeling vulnerable. I was a little, I would say I was a little scared. I'd had a long day, and I was looking. My eyes were wide, and I was seeking sympathy, and I found it in the building, and I found it in the people, and I found it in the seat, and even in the twilight. And one act of kindness goes a long way to making your entire environment feel better. And architecture can play a vital role in this. So I'm going to get a little heavier now to try to prove to you that all this kindness talk is not just silliness. It's not just like freshman speculation in the dorm after 2 a.m. Emerging studies in neuroscience, and these are emerging, this is really cutting edge stuff, indicate that humans are hardwired to seek visual evidence of safe, flourishing, nurturing environments, indicated by, among other things, rhythmic patterns of foliate growth, which exhibit a delicate balance of softness and strength, variety and order. They've done studies. They've measured people's hormone levels. They've taken people's blood pressure. And sometimes the best science tells you what you already know. When we spend time walking in a field of flowers or under a forest canopy, gazing at the undulating tree lines that crown hills and mountains, soaking up a sunset, contemplating the sea, or considering a babbling brook, our minds and bodies are restored. We are healthier. Our bodies do better. Our fight or flight hormones go down, which means our body can then spend more time committing our immune system not to fighting off a threat, but to maintenance. So say, cutting back on the likelihood of cancer and of Alzheimer's and of a number of other things that seem to be tied to stress and to lack of sleep and to having too many fight or flight hormones raging in your body, part of which is cued by environment. Our environment plays a large role in our basic sense of well-being. There's a whole theory called Kaplan's attention restoration theory that helps explain the aesthetic ingredient in this, and that is that the soft fascination of reassuring patterns engages our minds while allowing us to unwind. It's not just about being in flowers and trees because we like nature or something as basic or as like hopelessly large as that. I'm talking very specifically the way these patterns relate to our brains, the way flowers relate to our brains, the way the canopy of a tree relates to our brains. And there's a physical reason, not just a physiological, but a physical reason for this. And that is our brain cells are unique in our body in that they have to constantly burn oxygen to survive. Like they cannot stop burning oxygen. They are always active. They are always going, and it can be a torment. And if you don't have, sensory deprivation is a form of torture. Solitary confinement is a form of torture. These are things that can drive you mad. But being able to, but also being overstimulated, having too much to process, having too much to think about, can also can be unhealthy and unpleasant. But a soft undulating pattern of the kind you might find in foliate growth, of the kind that we were created to, or evolved to, or both, depending on your take on things. That we are keyed into these things at a very fundamental biological, genetic, evolutionary level. And our brains can look at these things, can watch a sea, the sea can watch a fire flickering, can watch a river go by, and it can occupy it at just the perfect level where we can actually relax and unwind. And architectural ornament can play a huge role in this. So humans are constantly seeking cues from their environment. We respond to those cues on many levels and many ways, both ways that we are aware and ways that we are not aware. We have a history of investing architecture with the visual language of gentle vitality to create kind environments. And these are visually kind environments and psychologically kind. And of course, there's a link between those two things. Classical architecture breathes and pulses with such life, with such vitality. So I'm going to very briefly talk a little bit about this building, partly because it doesn't have any columns, and we've already talked about column capitals and how they express negotiation, how they convey softness and gentleness to the lintels that they support. If you look at this triumphal arch, you have these massive piers, right, to the left and to the right, and then you have a band above with a meander in it. Now, a meander, often called a Greek key, is a perfect example of this kind of undulating rhythm, this kind of swirl, almost like a gust of a breeze, or the crests of waves, or of the foliate growth of a creeping vine, or even the patterns of biological things like seashells. And so this is exactly the kind of thing that your eye loves to just kind of gently go across. And what this does as it crosses the pier is it takes its time. It's not just an abrupt direct line, right? It takes its sweet little time, and it goes around and around and around, and it beckons you on as it does. And it's also simultaneously summoning the strength of the pier. It's saying, come along, pier, as it goes from right to left, and it's approaching the middle. Come along, buddy, come along, force and power. We have a job to do, pier. And it summons the full force of that pier to the springer on the arch, which is then visibly supported. You see that arch is being visibly supported by the whole pier because of the way that meander works. And then as the arch springs up, it has a herald, for crying out loud, that is trumpeting to the arch, to the pier on the other side. We're coming. We're ready to do our job. We're good. Come on, team. We're going to meet in the middle, and we're going to work together, and we're going to make this magnificent, huge vault that could be terrifying, frankly. I mean, it's terrifying to stand under huge, enormous things. But with these heralds conveying to each other this collaboration, and as these arches with the full support of their peers behind them reach up, and then they meet in the middle, they don't obliterate each other, but rather they meet with a celebration, with an affirmation, which is the keystone. And importantly, keystones, there's a million different ways to do them, but very often there's a human head there, or there's a flower, or in this case, there's a kind of undulating, scaly, textured, and there are many better classicists in the world than I am, and you might know that that's an abstract dolphin fish tail or something. I don't know what it is, but it's a little scroll bracket. And it's the softness, the organic nature of that is important. You can also have a big, strong, powerful keystone, but in this case, this soft one, it conveys that there's like extra vitality, extra life in this whole structural system. And that one little extra, that soft key, summons the full force of those piers to support the entablature above. And of course, the cornice goes the extra mile, no abruptness. It's all pleases and thank yous and good morning, ma'ams, and good afternoon, sirs, and a constant negotiation as it works its way up this triumphal arch. And then you get to the top, and you have this, it could have ended, frankly, with the top of the cornice, but it would have looked a little squat according to human proportions. So we have, in addition to a body and legs, we need a head. And so we have this crowning band across the top, which is a perfect blending of the horizontal and the vertical. This whole thing is about the vertical becoming horizontal, and then at the top, the vertical and the horizontal are seen in perfect unison. And then, of course, we have this undulating biological crown, this parapet at the very top, which helps it blend into the sky. This whole thing is a series of negotiations and interactions that in which no piece is seen taking advantage of the other piece. They are all working together, and they are all kind of triumphing. You see a lot of these same basic principles, not just in Western classicism, but also in many different architectural traditions. And we're going to look at this tiny little building, and I'm going to look at a bigger building in the Maya tradition. So as you just saw, this is a kind of gate. It's a gate not for military parades, but rather it's a gate for the sun. It's a tiny little building, but it does a lot of things that Western classicism does. It's perfectly symmetrical. It's got a clear human scale in the door. The two little windows on either side are perfectly scaled to a human head. And then we have a big cornice along the top. There's masks in that frieze that are positioned above the door like a keystone, and indeed it's the masks suggest life and vitality exactly where you need it in the keystones. The building is healthy and vibrant. It's not going to collapse and rot and die and kill you. And then we also have masks on the corners, another key structural place. And then, of course, it doesn't just end, but it has this tower at the top, which tapers until it ends in the sky. So that's just a tiny little building that's with its symmetry and its human scale and its cornice and its keystones and its coining, if you will, and its tapering roof. It does a lot of these same transitions. It engages in a lot of these superfluous, you might say, psychological ingredients that convey a sense of not only intentionality, but of harmony and of unity and of stability. This is a much larger building. I want to talk about a couple of these. But before I go into it, since the Maya aren't especially well known, I want to tell you a couple of basic things about them so that these buildings have become a little more clear. So this stuff looks a little chaotic to us because we're not used to it, but rest assured that notions of beauty existed. This is Stephen Houston again, of that which was good, better, best, and most pleasing and appropriate to the Maya. Right? These notions fostered thought, fit with orderly principle, and displayed systematic patterns. They were extremely good at creating meaningful, repetitive patterns that keyed into multiple visions of how the universe worked in their estimation. The classic Maya believed that animate matter and things might associate with humans. Energized by spirits and energies, stones had the capacity to see, smell, vocalize, and breathe. In some cases, a god lived within their stony frames. Sensitive to this vitality, humans took charge and forced these substances to obey. People are frail, but the lesson, it seems, is that they are neither helpless nor completely mortal. So I've been talking about architecture metaphorically, as if it has this, as if it's capable of being kind to itself and to us. But the Maya believed it could be, that it was alive, and that it engaged with you. And that's one of the reasons why we see these same ingredients in their buildings. So you'll see, again, we have these masks. The masks are on the corners, right? And then you have masks, a stack of masks in the middle above the doorway. These masks are also a hieroglyph. They mean wheats, which is to say they mean living stone. The Maya saw stone as a living material, a lot like plant material. It's alive. It's very slow, and its spirits are hard. Its personhood is harder to access than, say, the personhood of animals or even plants. But it is alive, and the hills are what happens when the earth wants to meet the sky, and it very slowly rises to meet the sky. And when lightning strikes from the sky to the hills, that's the sky in reciprocity. They understood cycles of creation, that when they saw mist emerging from caves, they knew that led to rain, because they experienced this inside of caves. They went with the dripping roofs. And so they see the stone and the sky and the living forces that unite all of these things as being capable of being called forth and embodied in their architecture, so that their homes were part of a living social and spiritual fabric that could make people feel good, and that could help their society maintain the bounds of relationships and courtesy, and indeed of kindness, that enable all societies to thrive and survive. So in addition to having these masks on the corners and above the main doorway in this symmetrical building, which is where the structure of the building must be at its most rigorous, where the life is most important. But if you see these bands that create these kind of inverted triangular forms in the upper register, those are double-headed serpents. And those represent the sky. Those represent the heavens. And so in between these double-headed serpent bands, you have a lattice pattern that there's a few theories as to what that represents, and most of them are probably true. One of them is that it represents the lattice of thatch and pole and construction, which you find in humbler buildings for thousands of years. So it's a kind of skeuomorph, a reminder of thatch construction in this stone building, which means that the stone is resembling a living material, a botanic material. Another theory is that it represents textiles, which are also made out of organic materials, and that's also true. Another theory is that it represents the night sky. Another theory is that it represents the social fabric, and that just like the night sky is full of stars, so too our society full of individuals. And indeed, the stars are ancestors. And so, there's a parity in that fabric, which by the way would have been vibrantly colored originally. That whole thing represents the fabric of Mayan society as well as the cosmos. And the way that fabric interacts with the lower register, which is where the human bodies are privileged and given a kind of blank background, creates a vault-like shape that is evocative of the Mayan interiors. The Mayan didn't have true arches; they had corbelled vaults, and as you can see, they also had colonnades, which more on that in a moment. But this corbelled vaulted space is being abstractly represented in that mosaic on the front of the building of the facade. Thereby, this building is thereby able to summon the full power of living stone, which is alive partly because of its engagement with the heavens and with the cycles of creation, and to spatialize it as a place of discourse and discussion for Maya polities and for Maya government and for Maya citizens. Now, I need to be very specific when I say Maya polities. Because you see that temple in the background? That is an example of unkind architecture. That is a living mountain, and buildings can not only see and hear you and nurture you and envelop you and bring you together with the ancestors, with the cosmos, and with each other, but they can also, next slide, they can also eat you. You'll probably realize that chamber at the top of the staircase, that's a face. They have anthropomorphized this building to such an extent that it is a hungry monster. And indeed, the word for doorway in Maya, chol, is the same as the word for mouth. It's Jol. And terrible things would happen in this building. This is an unkind building. This is a building that consumes and destroys. The building we just discussed is part of the other building, the building that uses the arch and uses the sky and uses living stone to create a living architecture that is whole and that is welcoming, is part of a complex called today, we don't know what they called it, the quadrangle of the nunnery, which was a council area where where different people from all around the polity of Ushmal and probably from beyond would gather to discuss. There was kingship here, but there was also clearly a council system that allowed different people to participate in government. And so this architecture is not a hungry, ravenous, cruel architecture, but an architecture that emphasizes the importance of fabric and of life and of joint enterprise. So if you look at the columns, we have, again, a really great example of a column designed to go from horizontal to vertical, back to horizontal, supporting an entablature that goes above and beyond with a sculpted frieze and a flanged cornice that's decorated by a series of little flowers. Anytime you see flowers, not all the time, but most of the time, you're looking at something designed to be delightful. Those columns are kind of blown out, but if you look at better columns that survive better elsewhere, you can see that the capitals on these columns are also designed to convey a softness. It looks like a bundle that has been tied around its middle and is being gently squeezed, and so it is projecting below and above to convey a sense of softness. I'm amazed by how softness plays a recurring role even in stone architecture. So I talk a lot about those little colonnaded buildings because their similarities to Western classicism are so strong. It's amazing to me. But briefly, before we leave the Maya, I want to talk about the building behind it, which again, we have this blank register, which is where human beings would go. And it's remains blank, I think, because the pageantry of human beings and their costumes and their textiles, because there were also flags and banners that were a part of the Maya world, that is designed to provide a blank backdrop for that. Above, we see the kinds of patterns that enrich the human eye, and in this case, refer again and again and again to life. The stack of masks again refers to living stone, and you'll notice again these are above doorways, helping to cue the Maya audiences into seeing this building as strong and as living and as supportive and vital. You also see a meander, a lot like a Greek key, in fact, which is a little strange, isn't it? Now, that meander, which looks like a couple of G's, that one upside down and tied to the other, is most likely an expression of breath, the misty breath again of mountains and of living stone. But it's also something else. The lattice behind it is full of flowers. And this is a flower house, indeed. It's called the Katail Nach, which means flower, which not only means flower house, it also means council house. This is where people of different parts of Ushmal society would gather to discuss laws, to pass judgment, to engage in the creation of treaties, to do all the things that governments and societies have to do in order to continue to flourish. And whenever the Mayan nobles would gather, they would bring their own textiles with patterns that represented their polities. And these would very, very, very often be covered in flowers. In addition to that, the Maya used the flower as a metaphor constantly it's almost as if that the flower is a passageway into another realm. And that the sweet smell of the flower is likened to the breath of your ancestors. It's also likened to the breath of living people who are engaged in constructive conversation that helps to build a society, that helps build to make a place flourish, to make a place, well, you might say flower. And so those Greek keys, those meanders, in addition to providing that kind of undulating rhythm that we all love to see, right next to a lattice work of flowers of the kind we all love to see, that Greek key may also suggest the smell of the flowers, not just the mist of the mountains, but also the smell of the flowers and indeed the sound of discourse and the breath of a loved one compared to the scent of flowers in Maya inscriptions. And, you'll see that in between the scrolls and the lattice work is a little house, a little abstract house that's placed above the door. And this little house has some thatch. That is another representation of a flower house, a place of discourse, a place of discussion. And it is surrounded by this lattice work of flowers, which is the ancestors, which is the fabric of citizens, and these scrolls, which represent speech and discourse. and in the memory of ancestors as well, all taken up by this living stone, which is perfectly symmetrical, extremely human scaled, and full of the kind of patterns that give our brains rest whenever we look at them. And I know, the first time you look at this, because as Maya, it looks a little too complicated, but remember also that the color would have played a large role in making these more legible. And so here again, we're about to leave the Maya, but we're looking at buildings that were believed to be actually literally alive, and that there were rules for making them beautiful, and that those rules required you to strategically use iconography and decoration to create patterns affirming the presence of life, affirming not just the presence of any life, but of the superfluous beauty of flowers, and also of the tectonic language of keystones, of corners and coining, of columns and capitals, and of arches that are all figured into this larger tapestry of well-being and promise that requires discourse to maintain itself and requires mutual appreciation to sustain itself. So we're trading iguanas and stone for deer and wood. And we're going to go to the other side of the world, to Japan, which is Shintoism is another animate religion, another religion of animism that does not assert necessarily that the buildings actually live. It doesn't do this in the way the Maya do, but it does assert that there is a spiritual presence in objects and things that are not human, and indeed in things that you might not necessarily think of as alive. And wood is one of these things which was alive, that then when used in architecture maintains some of its spiritual power. So we're going to look very quickly at a small Shinto temple district in a mountain town called Takayama. And these mountain towns are amazing because really the wood of Japan is simply better than almost any other wood. And that's not because it's because they make Nintendo and stuff, which I love, but it's because of geological and climatological reasons. They have it's a mountainous island, or a group of islands, as you all know. And those mountains had a lot of volcanoes at one point, and they produce volcanic soil, which is fantastic for growing trees. And the rain that comes to Japan is very, very frequent, and the summers are hot, and the winters are cold, and you have these wonderful seasonal cycles. So you have magnificent timber, and you for centuries and centuries of magnificent timber. So, wood is prized, celebrated, beloved, and has been for a long time. But when you enter this temple precinct, you have a gate which has a roof, which is obviously way above and beyond. You don't need a roof on a gate, by the way. This is almost completely symbolic. It's there to say hello. It's there to say good morning. And then if that wasn't obvious enough, you have a huge flower, these beautiful golden flowers on the doors. Now, again, I don't want to play too fast and loose with my generalizations and universalisms. Flowers can mean many different things. You already have heard they mean several different things to the Maya. In Japan, they can refer to imperial families. They can refer to noble houses. They can refer to virtues and to principles. But the fact is, they're still flowers, and there's a reason why imperial houses choose flowers to represent them. They're beautiful. They represent health and bounty and life. And so when you approach this thing, that flower is going to cue several different meanings to you if you know how to read it. But one of them is the universal meaning of a flower, which is that you are welcome and that this is a healthy and kind and warm and friendly place. This little temple is one of the cutest little buildings I've seen in a long time. And everywhere you look, you see every time there's a structural intersection between a column and a beam, there's a little celebration. And some of these are structural and some of these are purely aesthetic, but most of the time they're both. You'll see where the two beams meet to create this pediment, you might say. You have a little crowning moment, which of course provides a beautiful a crowning finish and a little gesture that prevents the building from ending too abruptly, because we all know abruptness is rude. But you also have this beautiful metal bracket that unifies the beams, tying them together structurally, of course, but also expressing fully at life, including flowers. Below that, you have a symbol of a cloud that descends down. This comes from actually Buddhist architectural traditions. And you have, the white paint, of course, helps preserve the wood, it helps protect it. But in addition, it suggests lightness. And you see the white paint on the brackets. You see this in Buddhist and Shinto buildings all over Japan. The whiteness on the brackets suggests that they, like clouds, they're lifting up. That this is an effortless and gentle maneuver of holding this building up. And if you look at where the beams intersect with the columns, these foliations that just flow out from them, it's every place where these two members touch, life springs forth. It's almost as if the building itself was a kind of plant, and that it is not made of dead plants, but rather many plants have been brought here and then brought together in a living, wholesome unity. And the result is that you get a sense not only of well-being from approaching this building, but also a sense of wholesomeness and delight, which is the kind of thing that makes you feel safe and well. And of course, these things are all designed to be seen and are gifts of kindness. Even the way this building relates to the square. On one end, it ends fairly abruptly on the right, but on the left, it tapers back slowly in a series of masses, almost as if it's backing away but bowing every few steps, which is something you see in many different cultures, not just Japan. And then it ends in this little exclamation point, a little crescendo, just like a little pinnacle on the roof or something else, to where it doesn't end abruptly, but rather ends with a smaller sub-shrine. And thereby engages with you in a way that is deeply considerate of every motion, of every gaze. Now, the roof tiling systems in Japan are related to those of Korea and China, and you have these beautiful tiles, which are meant, of course, to shed water, but also to be fireproof. And in Buddhist and Shinto temples, you see, since the time of Buddhism, again and again and again, these swirls, which is a symbol of water. But very flower-like. And one of the reasons it's flower-like is because historically, and these are mostly gone now, I'm sorry to say, they're still around, but they're not everywhere. Historically, these were always flowers. Thousands of these remain. There was an art of the tile that suggested a foliate life, a beautiful flowery gift to delight every single person who walked past. The water symbol is delightful and is pretty, but it's also meant to kind of help the building not catch on fire. These play a much more, you might say, superfluous role of simply being elegant and kind, but also suggesting, again, just like the entire Shinto temple does, that the building is alive and well, and that it wants you to be a part of its purpose. These flower tiles were present not only in Japan, but also all over Korea. And to a certain extent in Korea, this tradition lives on a little more forcefully. Indeed, in Korea, you also see bricks that are given a botanic, flourishing life. And when you walk past a little house like this, which is in one of the few historic districts of Seoul, Bukchon Hanok village, every single brick is a gift. Every single brick is an act of kindness that suggests the house is alive, in a way that is inherent to our subconsciousness. But also, it's just delightful to walk past, just like all the flowers and the plants outside. I was there in the winter, so many of them are not flourishing right now. But these were all designed to make passerbys feel welcome. It's just a smile. It's a good morning. It's a good afternoon. And some of these things get extremely elaborate. And once again, so far we've seen it in France. We know it's in Greeks because it's called the Greek key. And we see it in the Maya, this undulating line, this completely superfluous line that just has no reason to be other than to delight your eye and to reward you on that fundamental psychological level in which we always want to be a little stimulated, because we want our brains to be able to process, to engage, to explore, and to discover, but we also don't want to be overwhelmed. And so, again, this perfect balance is achieved by the meander as it goes down. And indeed, between the meander, we have foliates, we have flowers, essentially. This whole wall is a gift. It's a kindness. And your brain is nurtured almost as if you're walking through a field of flowers or under a canopy of trees as you walk past this thing. So back to Japan, I was struck by this. This is a Buddhist temple, and I was just amazed as I walked around this thing, and I began to try to figure out the ornament, what the ornament's doing, where and why, and every time a structural member got near another structural member, it gave it a present. It was like watching a group of people who know and love each other work together to achieve something magnificent and invite me to be a part of it. Every time a piece of wood gets cut, the end grain is exposed. You know this, and that's vulnerable. So it's good to cover it with metal, so to protect it. But after it's covered, they put a little flower at the end, like without fail. And then this column, it has a column capital, which is itself foliation, which of course isn't a pillow. It's not an Ionic scroll. It's somewhat similar to a Corinthian column, however, in that it's a bouquet. It's a series of flowers which look soft and kind and gentle and alive. And then these beams, whether the beam is supported by the column, it brings the column a bouquet. And indeed, the beam that's tied into the column from behind also brings a bouquet. And then in the beam that goes halfway up it's giving it a bouquet. Everywhere you go, it's like these members are all getting married. They're in love, and every place something interacts with another thing. And yes, I know that these things are tied to pins that hold it together, but that makes it even more beautiful somehow. But even if it weren't tied to pins, it's providing a very valuable function, which is making the building look happy to be there. It's making the structure look polite and gentle. And this is how our societies, again, have to function. We also provide different roles in our society. At different times of the day, I'm a consumer or I'm a professional. Sometimes I'm a menial laborer. I can do all manner of things. But when I interact with other people, life is just better when they show me sympathy and I show them sympathy. And here this building is teaching us what it looks like when a fabric is composed of negotiation and celebration and mutual care. The elaborate brackets of Japanese architecture, those elaborate scrolls where the beams tie into the columns, the magnificent bouquets, it's all so superfluous. And it reminds me, of course, as you can gather by the slide, of the tea ceremony, which is an essay in the superfluous. Used, again, flowers. You walk in, there are not supposed to be many decorations in the tea ceremony, but this is not a sensual deprivation moment. This is not the kind of thing that the modernists love to talk about the Japanese architecture as being very sparse and simple. It has moments like that, but I'm telling you, they know how to do detail, as I think you've seen already. You walk into a tea ceremony room, and there is always a flower. And that flower has been carefully selected for the moment, not just the day, for the moment, and placed in a vase for the moment. And it has all the power of hospitality and grace and affection and respect bundled into itself. And then the tea ceremony itself, as many of you know, can take hours. A gesture to the left, a gesture to the right, the graceful twist of a wrist, and the discussions on the flower. You can see her cutting another flower. The tea hasn't even been served yet. All they're doing is flowers. And I know there's a history to this, which is kind of melancholy, that the sumptuary laws cause some people to have to take their cultural lives indoors. But the fact is, it's an exercise in nothing but superfluity, of just unnecessary gestures of kindness. So the cornice, all right, the profile of classical architecture is. It's so complicated. Why is it that people have asked this for centuries? Why are there so many lines in this thing? Why is there so many shapes? Why does it give and take and give and take? Why does it undulate? Why does it go back and forth? And there's been some recent research published on the history of people asking this question, why? A really good article by Michael Hill and Peter Cohane argues that there's basically three different dominant themes in the history of discussing how classical cornices and entablatures became what they became. One of them is anthropomorphic. One of them is rhetorical, and one of them is structural. Today, we don't care about the structural one. We're only going to talk about the anthropomorphic and the rhetorical. So the anthropomorphic suggests that the proportions of the entablature are essentially that of a human, and that of the most important part of the human, which is the human face, right? And so, as you can see from this, speculative, less speculative perhaps than my talk, but also speculative drawing, that the idea is that even though it doesn't look like a face, that because it incorporates the proportions of the face, that there is a mutual sympathy in this. Columns have been compared to human bodies. The capital is related to the word for head, for crying out loud, but also perhaps the cornice. We're meant to see ourselves, but in addition to anthropomorphic, and we'll look at another couple of slides very quickly. There's another famous one you may have seen. This is the base of a capital by Michelangelo, who drawing it couldn't help but turn it into a grumpy old man, just because the gives and the takes look so organic. They look like mouths and noses, and they're so soft. And famously, right, there was this idea that the cornice, if it was well proportioned, would look like a healthy, handsome person, but a badly proportioned entablature and cornice could look like a monster. So you had to be very careful. And the Maya, if they got a hold of this idea, would say, oh well, the cornice is our ancestors looking down on us, of course, which is a beautiful concept, and one that perhaps we could even incorporate. The other angle here, and it's important that this be taken alongside the anthropomorphic, the anthropological, because once we see ourselves in the cornice, then we have to ask, what does the cornice tell us about ourselves? And if this rhetorical argument has anything to offer, then it's along those lines. The give and take articulation of profiles was equated by Germain Beaufrand to the sort of figures and devices used to embellish speech. Now that's very important, because embellish speech, not just make speech, not just, I want a cup of tea. Tea already is an embellishment. I want a water. No, it's good morning. I'm glad to see you. I hope you're having a nice day. How are the kids? Well, glad to hear it. Would you mind if I was to purchase a glass of water? You don't? Well, thank you you have the best water. And so on and so forth. That it's the speech of negotiation. It is embellished speech, careful speech with gives and takes. You don't simply announce what you want. Give me that. And then the transaction is over. Goodbye. Or not even a goodbye. I have paid. And then you leave. This is about giving and taking, going above and beyond, and engaging in discourse. And so down to the second paragraph, profiles resemble the linguistic construction of syllables and words, as well as the rhetorical composition of poetic expression. When you have people who are trying to negotiate with one another because they're part of a social fabric, they don't just engage. Certainly, they shouldn't engage in abuse and oppression, but they also can't just engage in heartless, again, transaction. The job of this is not just to hold up the roof, right? The job is not just to exchange the money for the coffee bean. There's also meant to be an exchange of social a social engagement that is a mutual acknowledgement of the other person's value and needs as a human being, and the fullness as a human being. And so it goes above and beyond to delight, to make comfortable, to make somebody feel like they are important, that they matter to you. And the cornice is doing nothing but that. Yes, it's shedding water, the structural one, which we don't care about today. It's also saying hello in about 8 different ways. And then it's carrying you up to the sky, and then it leaves you with the sky by saying, "This, by the way, this is my friend, the sky, and she'll be taking it from here. I'll see you later." And to me, that's very powerful and beautiful. And the architecture itself is supporting itself, and it's graceful, and we have little brackets, and it's just so elegant. The balancing act of diplomatic communication, right? That nothing mean should be said with something else. That the cornice should not be degraded until it becomes mean. But when some of the portions are too small, it begins to look stingy or malformed. this is very potent rhetoric, which takes us to the next slide. A very famous book, The Theory of Moldings, which the Institute for Classical Art and Architecture has reprinted in very elegant fashion, if you don't mind me saying. It's by a guy named Walker, no relation, published in 1926. And the language he uses to describe these moldings is it's a lot like the language that I'm using. I've lost some time due to these technical issues, so I'll skip through the first part. But if you go down to the largest paragraph, convex moldings are robust, appear sturdy and vigorous, and rather crude in expression. What? So the pillows are vigorous. They look strong, like bulging muscles, but they can also look a little crude. That's interesting. Too many of them, and the thing starts to look kind of like, like somebody who spent way too much time at the gym, or maybe in the case, maybe it looks a little dad bod, which I can relate to better. Like it's got muffin top kind of, if it's got these too much convex moldings. Concave moldings weaken the surface but give powerful shadows, and if skillfully used are delicate in expression and give an effect of thoroughbred training. Thoroughbred training, I'm not entirely sure what he means by that. I guess he means somebody who's fit, somebody who knows how to like hold themselves up, good posture, right? They're not just flopping on the sofa the way a convex molding does. They're standing upright, and they are engaged in kind of attentive. And I mean, he's really anthropomorphizing stuff, and he's not even a Maya. He doesn't actually believe it's alive, but he's doing the same thing. He's saying he's emoting this stuff. So the last paragraph, having these things in mind, the designer will come to the conclusion that moldings are honorable things. They're honorable. You have to find compromise. The convex and the concave engaging in these compromises. And all of them are designed, of course, in unison, again, to express compromise between the other members of the building. They compromise with each other to create compromise. This language is a poetry of engagement and the superfluity of kindness. Architecture can be mean. We've seen the Maya building that eats you, that thirsts for blood. Well, architecture can be cued in to fears and to it can be deprived of moldings. It can be deprived of negotiations. It can be made cruel. Albert Speer's architecture for Hitler was notoriously devoid of anything soft, of anything kind, of anything that negotiates, of anything that does diplomacy. And is anyone surprised? Newgate Prison is a really great example of a building designed to make you feel awful. Ledoux was a master at buildings designed to make you feel awful, like you were going to be put through a sausage grinder if you went into that building for the wrong reasons. That's the headquarters of the boss. If you're summoned to that building, it's because you have disobeyed the king in your little industrial village, which is meant to make you healthy and happy, but also to keep you tightly under control. Ledoux was great at making classical buildings that manipulated the power of moldings and of a structure to create an architecture of unkindness. And indeed, by the time you get to the 1800s, political and industrial revolutions have made a lot of architects worried about kindness, worried about social cohesion, worried about chaos and depravity and all the things that seem lurking around the corner. The brutalities of the French Revolution, the brutalities of industrial Manchester. And so, the last couple of people we're going to talk about are Victorian architects who looked deep into architecture and into structure and saw violence and conflict and wanted to resolve it. Alexander Greek Thompson's one of my favorites. He's in Glasgow, which is, of course, an industrial city full of really awful slums at this time. They would demolish their entire medieval quarter in an attempt to get rid of all the rookeries. And Thompson was deeply concerned with social fabric. He lost a lot of children to cholera, and he was really interested in public health, and he wanted to make reform tenements so the poor could live in dignity and well-being. And he saw his classical architecture as a poetry of social upstandingness, you might even say, which borderlines on a pun, but for him, post and lintel structure for him, trabeation was had the power of social elegance in it. And when he did his buildings, he's called Greek Thompson, but he drew from India, he drew from Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, any culture. He even drew on the Maya. Even culture, every culture that engaged in trabeation had Greek Thompson's heart. And as you can see from this building, it's just trabeation after trabeation after trabeation. And he's borrowing from the Greeks all day long, but he's also really pushing the foliate growth, the organic, lovely softness of these piers and their capitals, and as they flower and as they provide gentleness to the rest of the architectural structure. Maybe because he's surrounded by all the Gothic ruins that Scotland abounds in due to the intensity of its Reformation. He had a lot of hard things to say about the Gothic. The arch, he hated the arch. He says, the arch is composed of a number of wedges driven by the pressure of the superincumbent parts of the wall. What are we to think of the soundness of a mode of construction which is based upon an essentially active principle of destruction? There is no rest for the arch until it is prostrated on the earth by its own suicidal act. He sees the arch and he describes it again and again and again as almost like a metaphor for a society of unwilling partners, in which people are pushed into a relationship in which they want out. And that it doesn't matter how beautiful you make your keystone, he's not going to fall for it. He knows that the arch is essentially begging for its own death. Perhaps this violent, perfect timing, Justin, perhaps this violent conflict of forces, this incessant struggle between stick-up and knockdown may account in some measure for the favor which the style has obtained with the cockfighting, bear-baiting, pugilistic people like the Anglo-Saxons. No affection whatsoever for the arch or for the Gothic. He's all about trabeation, which for him represents peace and kindness. And you can see in his architecture, he's adapting the Greeks all the time, designing new things, including iron, which he believed could bring the peace and the beauty of gorgeous classical trabeated architecture to the masses, and even into tenements. Greek Thompson, he sees the art, he sees Gothic architecture as structurally violent and trabeated architecture as peaceful and kind. Louis Sullivan was also concerned with issues about modernity and how architecture could be kind. As you know, he draws upon every culture on earth, but his architecture, I would argue, is still nonetheless in keeping with all the key principles of classicism, especially its reverence for nature and its dedication to kindness and the poetry of diplomacy. He tackled the office skyscraper, right? The corporate skyscraper, which he described in anthropological terms. How shall we impart to this sterile pile, this crude, harsh, brutal agglomeration, this stark, staring exclamation of eternal strife, the graciousness of those higher forms of sensibility and culture that rest on the lower and fiercer passions? How shall we proclaim from the dizzy height of this strange, weird, modern housetop the peaceful evangel of sentiment, of beauty, the cult of a larger life? Whether it be the sweeping eagle in his flight, or the open apple blossom, the toiling workhorse, the blithe swan, the branching oak, the winding stream at its base, the drifting clouds, over all the coursing sun, form ever follows function, and this is the law. So, Mies van der Rohe and many other modernists will quote his form follows function and destroy it, misquoting it brutally, frankly, to suggest that there's no need for flowers anymore, that there's no need for column capitals anymore, that there's no need for classicism, for beauty anymore, because function means you need a door that swings. Function means you need a lintel that sits, or a column that lifts. Function means that it also means I can just walk into a restaurant and say food, and then throw my money at them and walk out. Form follows function. But Louis Sullivan knew better. The peaceful evangel of sentiment, of beauty, the cult of a higher life, a sentiment of largeness and freedom, the charge of sentiment, the beginnings of true architectural expression through the addition of a certain quality and quantity of sentiment. We must now heed the imperative voice of emotion. He got it. He understood that, form follows function, all right, but the most crucial function of architecture, in his opinion, is sentiment. That's how the office skyscraper will be redeemed. It'll be redeemed through a number of things. Honesty, one of them. It shouldn't pretend to be a temple. But at the same time, it can't just be a brutal agglomeration anymore. It has to convey sentiment. Ornament, when creative, is a perfume. It is the smile of sentiment. The last line in the sonnet, the smile of sentiment. That's how architecture is kind, and it's one of the key ways. And so his column capitals are clearly superfluous, right? They're terracotta ornamentations. They're not holding up that skyscraper, but they're conveying the foliate beauty of an architecture that wants to be healthy and alive and to say hello to you. So, we'll leave with Gaudi. Again, who was obsessed with kindness and with social cohesion and with religion and with all the other venues that he believed architecture should and could serve a human being whose heart was being broken by industrialism, as he believed. Everything soft, everything organic, everything kind, but still he uses the classical architectural ingredients of column, base, capital, indeed of entablature, to convey an architecture that is alive, that is whole with itself, like an organism. It is in balance, and it is stable and unified, and welcoming to you, healthy to you. This is, I think, the only space in the world in which it looks like the ceiling is actually the active member, and the column is the passive member. It looks like the way that these columns kind of tuck into their pillows, it's like they're a little strained, and the ceiling has rested on it. This is a grotto. This is a massive roof. I mean, it's more than a roof. It's like a cave. So you can feel the weight of that, and it's doing its very best not to crush those little columns. It's in between them. It's pulling up, it's billowing, it's trying to take its weight off, and the floor is also rising up those columns in an attempt to support them. This is another example of a poetry of architectural engagement in which you can see the different members trying to be good to each other. If you go into the Sagrada Familia, you'll see that you enter into a forest, like all the things we talked about, walking under a canopy of a forest, walking in a field of flowers. This is an architecture which is designed to look alive. And again, he's not a Maya, right? He's not even a Shinto believer. He doesn't actually infuse his architecture with spirit, but he believes that the world was made and that human beings have been created in continuity with that world, and that we need to be nourished by that world, and we need to respect that world, and that when these things come together in a wholesome and clear way, then not only beauty is the result, but also a spiritual enlightenment and an illumination. This is an architecture that is meant to look like it just grew there. So, people always talk about the Corinthian column and Vitruvius's account of its creation as a sculptor sees a basket left on the grave of a young woman who tragically died, and then some acanthus that spontaneously grew through that basket, and he realized it's beautiful, and then he goes home and he invents the Corinthian column. And this is usually discussed as a kind of formal exercise where he happens to see something that's kind of pretty, and then he goes and uses it. But these are the ancient Greeks. They believed that the gods made the world, and that the gods made the world in such a way that there was a fabric of existence that human beings are a part of. And so the idea that woman died, that's tragic. Like that's awful. That's sad. And that the basket of flowers that's left at her grave is a testament to suffering and to sorrow and to love that has been ruptured. But when the acanthus grows through that basket, it's an affirmation that she's not alone, and that her death is not meaningless, and that the suffering and the sorrow that was experienced as a result of that is part of a larger story of renewal and redemption, that could provide hope and to everyone. Earth itself was showing kindness to that woman, and that's the thing he captured, and that's the thing he brings to life in the Corinthian capital. I'm done. Bye. Just kidding, of course. That's very abrupt, and I'm not going to be abrupt because I'm not a modernist. I hope that this talk has been, again, at least somewhat provocative, even if you don't buy all the things I'm arguing. But the idea that architecture can can go out of its way, literally, to take on superfluous, unnecessary, or at least they seem superfluous and unnecessary forms in order to convey wholesomeness, both integral to itself, but also as a part of a larger world in which you are an important part, and that it can offer you a flower in the same way that you offer a friend a flower, and almost more importantly, you offer a stranger a flower. That I hope that you believe, at least, that the classical architecture has the power to suggest this on a poetic level that is of value to a nation and to a world that desperately needs more poetry. Thank you.